12.1 questions will deal with the Oregon country, and so we are going to go over the answers to the Google Slides that I had shared out here. So hopefully you had found a good picture of Oregon country and placed it in the space provided right here. So this is the one that I would like to use. And then the four countries that are competing for Oregon country in the early 1800s. And then you had to also explain how that was reduced in half. So the four countries are the United States, Great Britain, Russia, and Spain. So that's where we should at least start our discussion. So on our territorial expansion map, I like this one because first of all, it shows all the state borders, but then also shows all the claimed and then settlement areas as we progress. So you can see down here, Oregon country in 1846 is when it's finalized. But as we were reading in the book, that doesn't occur until 1846. But Americans start settling and going into Oregon and this territory in the 1820s. So how do we get rid of and deal with, of the four countries, which two are the first to go? And so they are Spain and Russia. So first of all, let's talk about Spain. Spain gives up their claim way back in 1819 due to the efforts of John Quincy Adams and the Adams-Onis Treaty. If we recall, in the Adams-Onis Treaty, we, the United States, got Florida from the Spaniards if we had given up claims to basically Texas. That was in 1819. Part of that whole treaty was the establishment of a border at the 42nd parallel. So what that did is effectively take the Spanish out of any claims into the area which will become Oregon country. So the Spanish give up that claim in 1819. All right. Russia, on the other hand, they eventually give up their claims about 5 years later. They basically give up and surrender any claim south of Alaska. So the Russians had moved across the Bering Strait here into Alaska and down the coast, and most of the time their interest was in fishing and also in seals for both either food or more likely their pelts. So if you see this thing called the Panhandle of Alaska, they continued to stretch all the way down here, and this is where their claim into the area ended. So that's how we get rid of and are reduced down to just two nations that are left. Great Britain and the United States. So what those two nations decide is they cannot come up with something that is agreeable to both on how to split the territory. So what they do is they jointly occupy the territory from the 1820s on. So for the next 20-ish so years, both British citizens and American citizens are able to come into this large expanse known as Oregon country. As you can sort of see, it makes up the states of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, parts of Montana, and then parts of Wyoming. But basically the three big states are Washington, Idaho, and Oregon. It then does stretch into what today is Canada, British Columbia, and that's the makeup of Oregon country. So in 1846, though, the United States and Great Britain are finally able to work out how they should do this, and basically what they do is they continue the 49th parallel that had already been a previous agreement, and they just take it all the way to the west coast. So the 49th parallel becomes that dividing line between the two countries. So we pick up with the third question, talking about the first groups into Oregon country, and then explaining why each group went. So hopefully you listed this in full sentences. So the first group would be mountain men. Now, mountain men go into Oregon territory for the main purpose of trapping and basically, securing pelts, beaver pelts, furs. And that's the reason they'll go in, is to basically go throughout there and find beaver and are able to trap them and then sell their pelts. So they basically traps around the hills of the Rockies and then into Oregon territory because there's just a numerous number of beavers that become very prized by both Americans and also Europeans. The other group that goes in are missionaries. And missionaries, of course, go in because they are trying to spread the Christian faith to the Native Americans. So those are the reasons why the first two groups go in. And then we want you to at least list down some of the famous people that were both mountain men and then missionaries. Now, mountain men would look somewhat like this, okay? wear buckskin, tend to have long beards, and no, this is not a never-ending beard. This is part of his coat. And then, they basically are somewhat by themselves. Periodically, they would work together to trap animals, but they also are important because as they wander around the areas of the Oregon country and also the Rockies, they're able to discover information about routes to the west. And they're eventually going to use that to become guides on the Oregon Trail. James Beckwourth is to note because he is an African American who went out to the west and was a mountain man, and then became important not for the Oregon Trail, but he found a mountain pass through the Sierra Nevadas. Now that would going to be very important for the California Trail to open up. Now on the other side, the Whitmans were a bunch of missionaries, and so here we have Dr. Marcus Whitman and his wife, Narcissa, yes, a very unique name there, and they were Christian missionaries that went out into what today is Walla Walla, Washington. It's always fun to say that. And they basically established a ranch there, and so they farmed a little bit, and more importantly, they tried to open up their mission to local tribes to come in and learn about the Christian God. And so they spread that kind of message, but they have a tragic ending to their story. The Whitmans, and there is a historic site still there today, the Whitmans were actually killed in a Indian raid. They were basically thought to be responsible for the deaths of some of the nearby Indian children due to them coming down with either measles or the mumps or anything like that. And so what the Indians thought was that the new people, or at least the strangers, had perhaps brought that kind of illness upon their children. And so one day they basically broke into the missionary and killed both of the Whitmans, killed some of their children, some of the other people that were there working with the missionaries. Only a few survivors were able to tell the tale, and so that's how we actually know what happened to the Whitmans. But the idea of missionary work tends to be dangerous, and so it continues still to this day. So we're now going to move on to Oregon Trail facts. That's the next part of your slides. Let's get through some basic Oregon Trail facts, something like length and time and all that other type of stuff. So the length is about 2,000 miles of the distance to get from the beginning of the trail, which is Missouri, to the end of the trail, which is in southern Oregon. So the time is going to take about half a year, 5 to 6 months, because of the 2,000 miles, you're covering 10 to 15 miles a day, so you can sort of figure out how they get there on that time. So beginning to end, remember, as we said, Missouri, Independence, Missouri, and then the Willamette is the way we say that. The amazing thing that most kids are shocked by is that 90% of the people who went to Oregon walked to Oregon. They did not, it was not like a family vacation where they all jumped in the wagon and then went. They actually walked beside it. The wagons were for their goods and their belongings, not really too much for passengers. So hopefully you have this filled in with some facts and then some pictures that go along with that, and then also finally a question that would not be answered in the book. So the end of the trail, there you get to the Willamette Valley out here in Oregon along the Cascades, even though they had started way back here at Independence, stretching over 2,000 miles. As we said, this journey takes 6 months, and the cool thing is that the people at the time knew they were making history. They knew that this was probably going to be the most exciting period of their life, and so they wrote it down, luckily for us. And that's where we get a lot of the history from this, is first-person accounts as they traveled on the Oregon Trail. I want to just share some pictures of the Willamette Valley. Here's a little bit, another one here. So very different, very nice and green and rolling, and so very different than crossing the Great Plains, which was very off-putting to many of the pioneers because it was a treeless prairie, and they had not been overly familiar with such large, vast expanses of just rolling prairies. So the next one will show you another map. You can sort of see the Oregon Trail starting here and then going along and getting into the Willamette Valley. So you can sort of see that here. I also have thrown in the idea of the South Pass. South Pass was an important pass through the Rocky Mountains to get into and on the other side of the Rocky Mountains. And so that was discovered by two mountain men, and now when we say discovered, it's a 20-mile pass, but it was important because this was sort of the gateway to allow settlers from the east crossing the Great Plains and then getting through the Rocky Mountains and into the other side of what was and would be the United States. Here is the beginning of the trail at Independence, and so this distance, of course, 2,000 miles, 5 to 6 months. Now in class what we did was we identified and colored the state of Missouri, so I just made it a circle. But if you could outline the state of Missouri, that would be great. And then what we also did was we traced that settlers start basically in the western side of the state, and they are going to follow. Now, yes, this is the Missouri River that comes through here, but once it branches off right here, this is known as the Platte River. So you should trace from right about here, the beginning of the state, and take it all the way over to the Rocky Mountains to show that this is the route of the Oregon Trail. Remember, they're going along the river for numerous reasons. One, water for their animals. Two, it's an easy thing to kind of follow. They just sort of follow the river and not easily get lost. And then also water for themselves. But once they go into Wyoming here, the elevations start going up. And so they've got to find a way through the Rocky Mountains, remember the South Pass, and then into this area of southern Idaho. So they want to stay south of these mountains and along this river, which is known as the Snake River, and they're going to follow that right over to what today is the current boundary, and then into and finally into Oregon. So if you could do that, that would be great. So wrapping things up here on the Oregon Trail of how they got there is this idea of the Conestoga wagon. So Conestoga wagon was a larger vessel than this one over here, which is sometimes called a Western wagon or a prairie schooner. So this was used a little bit more moving around town and things like that. But you could sort of see that this one has higher sides. The number of barrels and things like that that could be fit in here were much greater. The Conestoga wagon is a place here in Pennsylvania. Conestoga is down towards the Lancaster area, and that's where they first built it, thus the name Conestoga wagon. So what I'm going to do is just show you this short little video here. Hopefully it works, and then we'll move on.
The Conestoga wagon is a recognizable image of life in early America.
The wagon is a
The large
recognizable
wagon box
image
and
of
curved
life
white
in early
cover
America.
reminds people of pioneers, settlers, and life before cars and airplanes. The Conestoga wagon was first built in the Conestoga region of Pennsylvania in 1770. It had a wagon box that was curved, rising at both ends so that when it went up and down hills, the loads it carried wouldn't shift as easily, and then the tailgate wouldn't have to bear all the weight and risk breaking open. The Conestoga wagon could carry loads up to 6 tons and was usually pulled by 6 horses or oxen. It had a white hood made of canvas to protect the load in the wagon box against bad weather or extreme heat. The canvas was soaked in linseed oil, and that made it waterproof. There is a common misconception that the driver would sit in the wagon and drive the team of horses or oxen. Instead, the driver walked alongside of the wagon and directed the horses. On long journeys, no one rode in the wagon and everyone walked so that there was less stress on the horses. The average Conestoga wagon was $250. That was a lot of money back in the 1800s. It cost so much because it took multiple craftsmen to build it, but the wagons were very sturdy and could go on nearly any terrain.
So the other one I want to just talk about is this prairie schooner that's mentioned in your book. A schooner is a vessel, a ship, a boat, if you want to think of it. So it says, by pioneer families heading across Oregon Trail in wagons like these. So sometimes they called them prairie schooners, like a prairie ship, because from a far distance, sometimes the grasses of the Great Plains would obscure the wheels, and from a far distance it looked like they were floating on a sea of grass, and then those white tops looked like sails, and thus the idea of the prairie schooner is born. Some other strange inventions I always like to share out with kids is there were people that tried to come up with a way of harnessing the wind. The problem was they didn't really figure out how to easily brake and stop these things, and also they did not figure out how to steer them effectively. So it became a quick way of injuring yourself, and these things really never took off. So on this slide of Oregon Trail, you can sort of see various points along the trail that were important. Now, eventually, the U.S. Army is going to put out forts, and those forts were places of trading. It's also protection, those type of things. But you also had these things that were just naturally occurring things that kind of were signposts to people. So the first one that I want to sort of share with you is this one called Chimney Rock. Chimney Rock is in Nebraska, and yes, that's a natural type of setting there, and they say it's well over 300 feet high, so it's pretty impressive for people to go by and see. The other one, other than Chimney Rock, is it's Independence Rock. I know kids are like, oh, how can you get excited about rock? Well, Independence Rock was this huge monolith of a rock, and the reason why it gets its name of Independence Rock is that, well, first of all, people put their names on it as a way of like remembering them in history. But the other thing is that this was sort of a guidepost that you hope to reach this spot of the trail by or before Independence Day. And that way it could tell if you were on track to cross the Rockies with enough time that you're not going to get stuck in them in any early snows in late summer. Yes, in late summer. So this might have been the way, big sky country, those type of things. So I wanted to end here with the two definitions on the last slides about manifest destiny. Remember, manifest means to make known or make evident, to make clear. And so destiny is your fate. So what did you want to make clear about your fate or your future? And Americans at the time caught onto this phrase that it was the fate, it was what was expected, that America was to spread across the continent from one ocean, the Atlantic, to the other. And that was our manifest destiny. Stated by a newspaper columnist by the name of John O'Sullivan, he basically kind of put in this phrase in the American language that it was our future, it was our destiny to possess the whole continent. And so I know some of you are thinking, we have Canada and Mexico. But at the time, the big push was to reach the Pacific Ocean. And you have to understand what was in our way at the time, which were other countries. There were, of course, native peoples that were living there. The big areas that they wanted was, of course, Oregon. We talked about that as done peacefully through negotiation, but these other two are going to be acquired through violence and war. So in section 2, you're going to read about how Texas is acquired by Americans moving in there and then wanting it and then fighting to grasp it away from the country of Mexico. California, on the other hand, is obviously a province of northern Mexico as well, and that will be talked about when we discuss the Mexican-American War. The last thing was, what was 5440 or fight, and try and find an image about it? Well, it was a political slogan in the 1844 election. So we talked about one in 1840. Now we're going to talk about this other one. And it refers to, this 5440 refers to this line in the Oregon country. So supposedly the Democrats, I'll go back to them. This is Henry Clay and the Whigs. They didn't really push hard for a big, expansive kind of feel to take all of Oregon from Great Britain. But the other group, which were the Democrats, they were headed up by James K. Polk here, and they were big expansionists. And so they wanted to campaign that if you elect us, we are going to be very forceful in trying to achieve our idea of reaching the West Coast. So Polk is able to defeat Henry Clay in the 1844 election and wins. Now, did we fight? And the answer is no, we did not. As you know, we, the United States, came out with an agreement that was worked out that settled on the 49th parallel. So even though James K. Polk said he was an expansionist that would fight for the 54th 40 line, he settled through negotiation on the 49th. So that is where we end with the discussion of Oregon country and prepare for our discussion then of the next area, which will be Texas.